So today we're exploring how network nation can go from being merely a conceptual framework into becoming an actual political movement. In fact, in this podcast series, we have explored the ideas of network nation and what are the communities around the world that are actually leveraging those ideas in order to experiment towards new modalities of governance. But ideas alone cannot change the world. And so, how those network nations can move from a conceptual framework that is mostly interesting to researchers and to a few practitioners to an actual movement that community can join, build around, and organize. And perhaps one interesting concept here is the concept of Scenius, which was introduced by Brian Eno to describe the collective form of genius that emerge when the right people come together in the right container. And you can think, for instance, of the jazz scene in the 50s or the early days of the internet, where there was no single visionary, but rather an ecosystem of people that working together actually make an inevitable breakthrough. And so this is what we're trying to do with network nations, but of course, this is not something that happened by accident. And so we're joined today by two practitioners who are helping with this transition of bringing network nations toward becoming an actual movement. Patricia Parkinson and Benjamin Life are two long-term practitioners in the field of community governance, currently working on the OpenCivics Project. And they have both been deeply involved in creating communities and larger movements to support individual engagement and civic participation. And so together, we will explore how can we grow a movement around network nations without falling into the trap of institutionalization. How can we onboard people beyond the tech world into something that actually feels like a real political project? And then, of course, what are the concrete steps that can turn a scattered constellation of experiment into a coordinated force? Great. So thank you very much for joining us today. The idea today is to explore how do we actually build movements around the network nations, and why do we want to build a movement, and how do we actually achieve that. So to start with, perhaps like one big question is like, do we need to transform the network nation, which right now is mostly like academic or conceptual endeavor with like a community of practice? Why do we want to turn it into a movement?
I think my first instinct to say is because we want it embodied in real life. We want to not just theorize about these ideas, but we want them to gradiate into relevancy in our lives. And that means that there are real people engaging with these ideas related to real problems and real opportunities. And it means getting messy.
hmm And so, if we were to try and characterize the movement that we want to build, a movement usually comes with a theory of change. So, what would be that theory of change that we are endorsing?
Yeah, there's some terminology that we've developed inside of the context of open civics that I think is relevant here. And we sometimes refer to it as a civic hyperstructure, or said more plainly, the kind of network effects that happen through the interoperability of many different efforts. And I think when we're doing a kind of parallel society project like Network Nations, that's really reimagining the social contract from the bottom up, our theory of change has to be rooted in the kind of pluralistic and polycentric coordination among people who are oriented towards that same vision of a parallel society. And so having kind of core grounding principles around the kind of core ethic and design paradigm of network nations enables that kind of agent centric self organization where each of our individual efforts become more powerful when we are actually able to stitch them together. And a parallel society requires many different modular components that are able to work together. And so the Network Nations community of practice becomes a place where people who are building those building blocks of a parallel society can find each other and strengthen the mutual benefit, mutual reinforcing feedback cycle that's only possible when we're coordinating together.
Yeah, to me, I think indeed, there seems to be a lot of similar ideas and similar communities that are somehow popping up in the last few months and years. And I guess they are currently lacking a common umbrella in order to actually understand that we are actually fighting the same fight. And I guess creating and articulating the theory of change of this movement that we're creating might also become a gravitational force for all those communities to see each other as being part of the same movement, right? One thing, perhaps, an interesting question is as we talk about parallel societies, um, there seems to be different flavors of those parallel societies, and of course, the big one name that comes to mind is the network state movement. Do you consider this to be a movement? Do you consider this to be where does it stand in that level? Because it is definitely having this gravitational force that different endeavor and community are associating themselves around this name. So how do you see the network state in relationship to movement building?
I think the kind of astroturf social movements that we've come to expect in the 21st century, um, like network states, where there is an authentic movement behind it, but it's mostly being catalyzed and coordinated through the same forces of capital and markets, that it's responding to the collapse of our current social contract, but the thing that is coordinating it is still the same kind of underlying extractive ethos that has gotten us into the current systemic mess that we're in. And so I think there are aspects of it that do present as a genuine movement. I think its benefit and its fatal flaw is that it's primarily organized around markets and extraction, whereas I see network nations being more oriented and coordinated through commoning and through coordination of commons governance. And I think that puts us at a slight disadvantage. I think this is why we're kind of coming out of the gate slightly behind the network state movement in terms of its level of mind share and development. But I think ultimately that's what will allow our movement to be healthy and successful in the long term, is that we're coordinating around a very different underlying theory of change and ethic than the network state movement is.
And something that I'm coming to better understand is just a little bit more nuance related to the stages that come prior to something being cohesive enough and coherent enough to be considered a movement. And one of the ways that I've heard this referred to is first you start as a category. It's a descriptive lens that explains and helps give a shared language and understanding to the thing we're talking about, which in this case we might say, parallel societies or insert other word here. And then that grows in maturity into a scene, like a scene, or what is called sometimes a scenius, which is like an emerging community. It's very loose. It's like based on resonance. And then if people are going to transition into a place where they take like role-based authority or other types of mutual obligation, then it starts to form into the underpinnings of a movement. And one of the things that I think, Network Nations, Network Nations Alliance is working towards is related to those commoning activities that maybe it would be a little bit more prevalent than in the network state context, growing incrementally through those stages to the point where people are really willing to, as part of a larger collective effort, take on that level of responsibility through roles.
Mhm. And maybe as we try to delineate the boundaries of that movement, of the domain of that movement, is and you relate to the concept of Scenius, which I think we should dig into as well. It's to some extent, will that make sense to say that the network nation and the network state are two nodes in the same sinews that is this kind of reinventing sovereignty in the digital age, and therefore that we might actually be part of a larger movement and we just have different way of fighting that fight, or do we consider them to be a different movement that is part of a different Scenius, right? And maybe there are some similarities, but the overarching theory of change is too different to qualify them as part of the same Scenius.
I imagine that they're for sure part of the same category, but I would question whether or not they're part of the same Scenius because the Scenius is oriented towards shared culture. And I imagine that some of the values and ethical principles underpinning the network state movement versus, like the network nation movement are actually quite different. But I'm curious what you would think about that, Benjamin.
Yeah, it's funny. I've had personal experiences with this, and it's one of the most beautiful things about creating third spaces, like the Regen Hub that we've created here in Boulder with Kevin Iwaki and a number of other community members, because I was at a happy hour on top of the Regen Hub roof speaking with a network status, trying to unearth or uncover where are the overlaps? Where are we actually in alignment or solidarity? And I came up with a kind of general rule that I think could perhaps support these movements in relating to each other in a more healthy way, which is really about functional sovereignty. I think the one issue that I think could prevent network nations from collaborating with network status is all at all is the way in which the network state relates to power has still within it a kind of fascistic tendency, although I think that's a little bit overplayed. And I think there are many network state folks who actually are much more anarcho-libertarian than they are fascist or statist. But within that scene, there's a diversity of different orientations to it. But I think if we can align on this idea of functional sovereignty, that communities should be able to self-determine the institutions and exstitutions that they participate in and govern, then a plural range of different strategies and flavors and approaches to that could all be part of the same kind of cosmo-local learning loop where different local experiments feed back into a global commons of experimentation and learning. And in that way, we are part of the same Scenius because we're responding to the failure of the Westphalian order in the 21st century, even though we're taking on very, very different approaches to what that parallel society could look like. But there will definitely be insights gleaned through any real practical experimentation and other ways of organizing society. And so I don't think we should be antagonistic to the network state because I do know many people inside of that movement who actually are very interested in bioregionalism, very interested in regeneration, very interested in improving our functioning of our democracies. But they're also mixed in with folks who want to see the state run like a corporation, who have no problem with the more fascist orientations of that movement. So I think it's nuanced, but I think there's room for solidarity.
Let me try to poke at this in the sense that there's two possible interpretation of this, right? Which is one is the network state movement is actually quite plural in the different value system, different theory of change that it embodies. Another interpretation is that there are people that, for lack of a better movement, are describing themselves as part of the one single movement that they know of in this particular latent space of reinventing post-Westphalian sovereignty. And so they are self-defining themselves as like, yeah, we are exploring the network states. But do they actually belong to that movement, or do they lack not better, because it's not about moral judgment, but a more fine-tuned movement that is actually closer to their values, which if we were to perhaps suggest the existence of an alternative movement, then they might stop to recognize themselves under the network state movement and actually choose to recognize themselves under the network nation. Which one do you abide by?
Well, I'll say that I've at least had interactions with people who are engaged in the network state movement who, when learning of network nations, expressed that it was much more aligned with their thinking and their values, but they were at a lack or like a void of being able to jump into something and just wanted to start somewhere. So at least from that like first person experience, I think I've come across that a couple of times.
Yeah. Because also in one of the past episodes we were discussing, for instance, like with Vitalik, and like the question of like vibes, um, which is an interesting thing. I think the blockchain space has this a lot, where you have people that are advocating for pretty much the same theory of change, but somehow at the vibe level, it doesn't feel the same, right? And it's like somehow you have very separate communities that not necessarily like or dislike each other, but don't feel kinship amongst each other. Even though when you hear them speaking, they are actually talking about the same thing. They're advocating for the same thing. So it also feels that perhaps like this is something that we also need to take into account when we're talking about a movement. Are we just talking about what is the narrative that we're trying to promote? Or are we also accounting for what are the vibes, or I don't know exactly what's the best word to use, but what is the communities that are forming, which do feel kinship, not just at the intellectual level of what they are advocating for, but also at a more personal and relational level of wanting to be part of the same movement.
I think that aesthetics definitely matter as a way of organizing people. And I think that getting to these kind of undergirding principles that inform the Network Nations movement, I think that enables the kind of pluralism that the movement requires, where we can agree to disagree about certain aesthetic dimensions. And I keep coming back to this phrase of functional sovereignty because I think it's a very load bearing term for network nations in that it describes a certain design criteria for what constitutes a network nation, that's focused on the self determination of the polity. And I think that is a kind of overarching principle, which in some ways liberal ideals of in the original formation of democracies in the most recent form, um, is the same kind of universal ethic, but captured by bureaucracy and institutions. But I think we should be very careful about not universalizing things and looking for what are the common threads that transcend the aesthetics or maybe are a layer deeper than the specific aesthetics and speak more to the design requirements that constitute a network nation so that we can enable that kind of pluralism.
Yeah, which is what we're trying to do with the theory, right? The theory is like what are the what are the design criteria, what are the boundary condition of like what are we talking about, so that people can self-select around this particular vessel. And one thing that we discuss a lot within the group is also that even though the theory can create something that obviously could be adopted by very different communities with very different value system. Like there is nothing in the network nation structure that says that it's only for like people that are lefties versus right versus whatever, up or down. Yet in the design of that vessel, there is this kind of like encoded values which do come with a bias that, well, if you like the commons, you can be a right wing and you can like the commons, but it turns out that statistically you will most likely be more pro democracy and pro individual empowerment rather than dictatorship. But it's just a bias in the design. It's not something that we advocate for, and this is where we try to distinguish between like political and meta-political. And like the meta-political agenda is clearly about building a particular vessel that will attract a particular value system, but then the vessel, of course, is up for grab to everyone, right?
Yeah, in our work with Open Civics, we have attempted to like articulate design criteria for gauging the outputs of a system or like a social organism related to like the health of a system. And we've come to articulate them as like vitality, resilience, and choice or participation. And those are the kinds of things I would be interested to know more about in becoming more familiar with network states and finding where the synergy or the divergence lives, as if those types of qualities and values are embedded in what is being created as like the underpinning design criteria, or like spark really meaningful conversation on where they might diverge.
Yeah, maybe to just map those divergences a little bit to explore the territory a bit further. I think there's something to do with territorial sovereignty that's very important to unpack with network states, because I think due to their access to capital, and perhaps some of their more transhuman goals that are sort of implicit in the subtext, there is this orientation towards territorial sovereignty through capital. The idea that you could exit a traditional society by creating special economic zones, by purchasing islands. There's a way in which that has a kind of neo-colonial logic embedded in it that I think network nations, by starting in the I guess both attempt to start in the kind of cloud, but if the network state's end game is always going to constitute itself through the kind of private acquisition of territory to create a kind of enclosure of that alternative society, that might be a fundamental difference. Wherein I think the network nations movement is more about the kind of re-embedding of pro-social relationships back into place through the kind of cosmo-local convening where as these kind of international networks of solidarity form, the way that they actually touch territory is not through claiming a kind of sovereignty over the land, but sovereignty as a community, and how we relate to institutions in place. And so I think those are really important distinctions. They might be irreconcilable. And perhaps people who are invested in the network state movement, when they hear this, they'll have a moment of realization that maybe it's not as aligned as they thought it was, if the kind of end game requires this neo-colonial move of acquiring territory, this idea of tabula rasa, that you could just buy land and start society from scratch, when in fact there's people who live everywhere. There is no starting from scratch. And so we're in the middle of the system's collapse. We don't have the luxury of just being able to buy our way into exit. And so I think Network Nation starts from this premise that sovereignty is something we produce together, not something that we can purchase.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great discernment line between those two movements. Perhaps we can discuss also like the who of that movement. So every movement needs to have like a particular community around it, which is what we are trying to build as we are building this movement. So um, the network nation, of course, is like pluralistic, transnational, transversal, etc. So when we're thinking about the who, like who are the participants, who are the members of this movement, like who comes to mind?
At this stage of the movement's development, I think a lot of it is about identifying those that are already engaged in the movement but don't have the awareness of the overlap between their efforts. So it's those that are engaged in academic circles or on protocol design or in the network state movement, but maybe feeling a little bit of dissonance in some of what is encapsulated in that concept. And so, like, in the first stage of movement building, I think it's about finding like the social, cultivating like the social gravity, and creating the shared containers for like those that are already doing the work and already impassioned around the shared telos. And then as the movement grows, it will imagine will start to expand to those that are stewarding communities that have characteristics of network nations and providing support systems to them in their pilots and experimentations.
And so, if we go back to the concept of a Scenius, right? Actually, can any of you provide a definition for the audience of like what is a Scenius?
Yeah, so the term was originated by Brian Eno, and it's a term for like a collective form of genius that comes to be when you have like a recognizable membrane. And in a lot of cases, a scenius is something that you can like vibe and like feel into and recognize, but doesn't have like a formal boundary around it, just like a recognizable clustering. Whereas as soon as you step into more from the scenius to the movement level, and you're bringing in institutional responsibility, then I think that like becomes like a more formal membrane. Would you add any definition to that, Benjamin?
Yeah, just that the social genius that emerges through the interactions between the participants. And so as ideas start to mimetically virally spread, they start to feed back on themselves. And so what starts as a simple curiosity then becomes a working group, then becomes an initiative, then becomes a research paper. And but at each stage, it's through the interactions between the members, which is another reason why I love third spaces, is because when you go there, you know your thinking is going to be improved just through the interaction and the connectivity between others who share a depth of shared understandings, but a different enough of an orientation where that difference of perspective adds some value to feed back into what you're already doing. And so I think that's how the collective genius emerges, is through the kind of sufficient alignment of worldview to bring people together. And then as those pieces start bumping into each other, new things sparking and emerging from them.
And so, do you think that we already have a Scenius around network nations, or do you think that part of the movement building is to actually create that Scenius, meaning like articulate it and but also encourage those interaction that perhaps are not prolific enough in order to actually generate a Scenius that is recognized as such?
Well, my experience in weaving is I, first met you this year in person in an immersion related to network nations, and I got to experience the culture that was present, and it was very obvious to me that there is a CDS that exists, but I think my experience so far has been that it is alive when in presence and proximity, but maybe not established sufficiently enough to be persistent. And I think that's what we're trying to nurture is the feeling of that persistence of the culture relating to digital spaces and asynchronous connectivity.
I would say Patricia is one of the most masterful game masters. If you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, a dungeon master is someone who's
So
there
I
helping to keep the story moving along. And one of the things I've learned from Patricia is in the field of experience design, creating these rhythms where we can coordinate without control once we have established these kind of rituals of connection and the practice of connecting. And so I think the simple yet powerful starting position of the Network Nations Alliance is, can we use that frequency of rhythmic convenings to start to help people feel more of that identification with the space? And then they become the people who spread the ideas, who bring other people in, because there's actually a gravity that they can pull people into.
And
Mm.
there's also a concept related to Scenius with like producing emerging visible artifacts. And I think that up until now, there's been a couple of key artifacts that have come from different people and different perspectives, but there hasn't been a lot of places that have been like weaving those together into a shared context. And even as simple as having a website that lists them side by side starts to have the movement like see itself more clearly, which I think helps the culture become more coherent.
Going back to the question of whom, so in activist theory, there is usually this distinction that is made between different actors that try to change a particular system. And we have the insiders, which are the people that don't like the way in which the system works and therefore are getting straight into the system, playing by the rule in order to change the rule. And then we have the outsider, which don't like at all the system and are like, we're gonna break it. And like it's the people like, doing mayhem in order to prevent this system from continuing to operate in a particular manner. And then we have the beyonders, where the beyonders don't like the system, but they also don't wanna touch it, neither from the inside or from the outside. And so their solution is, let's create another system, which ideally will attract people. And without having to touch the old system will become obsolete because it's less desirable than the new system. And so when we're thinking about building a movement, I'm curious, is a movement like, can we build a movement with only one typology of those actors, like just the insider, just the outsider, just the beyonders? And I think there is actually quite a few of those movements that are, like the environmental activists that are like trying to like, manifestation, demonstration, or like the beyonder group that are just doing. So is it desirable to actually have a movement that is specifically crafted around one of those categories? Or are we actually trying to create a movement in which those different actors can see the value that they each bring to the table and, in fact, cross pollinate their contribution in order to have a more coordinated action? In the context specifically of network nation, which I think initially sounds more of a beyonder, but I'm curious how you see the saliency of each one of those categories.
It's funny because I have personally embodied each one of those categories over the course of my uh, the last 10 years of my career, and um, started out in the kind of institutional reform space, working with big institutions like the United Nations. And I was really quite horrified at what I observed from the inside. There's a kind of external narrative of moral authority of these institutions that once you're on the inside, you see how actually fractured and broken they are, that quickly is dispelled. And then simultaneously, there's a kind of institutional gridlock and inertia that seems to make, I think this is why I became an outsider, is because I had these experiences. Um, and so a lot of the work that Patricia and I do with Open Civics is really trying to support communities in building dual power. Because I think that notion of functional sovereignty, again, is how communities have leverage in relationship to legacy systems. And I think we can't, protest our way to change. We can't just, ask nicely or expect that the people in power have even the agency to create the changes that are needed. And so I think it's actually through dual power that we can assert our leverage on traditional institutions and in some ways give them an out because I think they want something to change. They're just as trapped inside of the brokenness as we are. And I think by building these parallel societies, we can create partnerships at a stage where we're mature enough in our dual power to not be overtaken by the state or by institutional bureaucracy. But first we have to develop that leverage, and then we can go to those institutions and say, hey, the system that you're still holding up is not functioning to preserve quality of life, to ensure democratic participation. We've gone ahead and we front ran all of the design challenges of building a parallel one. And we've tested it and it's working and it has legitimacy derived by people participating in it, which you are increasingly lacking. I think that to me is the strategy where we don't abandon institutional change, but we focus instead on how the parallel society work can create opportunities of leverage where we can then have a negotiating position from a place of power.
Mm. Yeah, because you mentioned several times parallel society, which I think is a very beyonder concept. But I also think that parallel society implies that it's parallel, right? That they don't have a point of intersection. Whereas, at least in my view, the net as opposed to exactly the network state, which is like let's exit so that we don't have to intersect anymore. With the network nation, by definition, because we are doing additional layers of sovereignties, there is always an overlap, meaning that there is always an intersection. So I guess parallel, maybe it's parallel on the top as opposed to on the side, but I guess we cannot conceive of a network nation that is fully independent of the relationship with the nation state in which the members are residing, right? And so these requirements in some way of like even if we are beyond Earth because we're creating a new system with its own sovereign infrastructure, we cannot transcend the fact that there is a territory in which everyone is living on, which therefore oblige us to build those bridges, which in fact is oftentimes a criticism of those beyonders movement is that they just are creating their own little utopia, but there is no connectivity with the real world, and therefore it doesn't go anywhere because people cannot walk from one to the other. So in some ways, like it's a blessing and it's a curse because it's not possible to create this fully parallel society, but therefore it's also a blessing because it forces us to think more carefully about how do we build those bridges that then will be able to bring an actual change, right?
I sometimes use the term fork the system, and that implies that we can remerge. We're kind of exploring a parallel branch, which can never be fully separate from the underlying territory that we're embedded in, as you noted. But then this kind of patchwork that emerges through that parallel building, any cooperative, any commons, any mutual aid network, these are the kind of small individual components that happen in that space of the fork. And then as they cohere amongst each other, I think that is what creates the possibility for that remerging. And so
Mm,
I do see it not as something that should happen as an exit, but rather as something that can happen off to the side that then can influence and remerge back into the default social contract.
mhm. Interesting, yeah. Another question perhaps, building upon your metaphor, which is a great metaphor, but it's also a very techy metaphor. Building again on like who is part of this movement, how do we actually ensure that the people that are part of this movement are not only tech-oriented people that perhaps have already the tech savviness to engage with those forked sovereign infrastructure, whether this is blockchain technology or other decentralized infrastructure? And how do we actually make sure that this is a movement that is actually inclusive of people that perhaps are not techies, and yet will deeply benefit from being part of a network nation, or even maybe not just being part of a network nation, but also being part of the larger network nation movement.
I find it really helpful to remind myself of the concept of like socio-technical engineering. I think often when we are crafting digital tools that shape our way of being, we think of them only in like an engineering, like technical context, but like underneath it all, we're just humans having experiences that need to like feel good and be coherent to us, and often that's overlooked. And I think that that's part of like seeing ourselves all as designers, but like also the composition of who is creating what we're intending to interact with, and the diverse perspectives that they embody that are hopefully grounded in like real communities, real needs, and their own experience. So, for example, if we're developing out solutions that require technical components to it, which a lot of it's very relevant to what we're talking about, not skipping over the steps of centering the humans at the center and thinking of what are the feelings we want to invoke, what are the touch points involved in that, what are the realities of enculturation membranes and different things like that. I think generally we need a different type of composition in the room and in the conversation for those that are bridging theory and practice. And then that also makes me think of some of the defaults we've baked into our culture in developmental spaces like this, and being a little bit more aware of the biases present, or like the implicit conditions that like maybe don't feel as encouraging for those to speak to those types of considerations. So I think it's all, for me, all comes back to like the composition and ingredients in the room, and bridging past what has been a very default sense of like technical people developing solutions and bringing in the social and cultural components as an afterthought in some cases.
If I think about like examples of like movements that succeed and failed depending on the perspective, I think that, um, for instance, like the Web3 movement is quite a successful movement. But if we look at the population of that movement, it's pretty much techies and or speculators, but mostly tech speculators, even then. So it's very popular in a way, but it's not inclusive beyond the tech. Even though it has a cultural component, etc. Another example, which maybe is the opposite, is like Occupy, uh, which I think has succeeded extremely well in being inclusive and like including to everyone that wants to be part of that movement, and yet somehow failed to build the necessary infrastructure in order for anything to actually change, right? Because it's great to have a movement, but if the movement doesn't have its own infrastructural framework, then somehow little can be done. So I feel like those two movements are both very popular in one direction, but have kind of failed on the other. So how do we envision, as we're building the network nation movement, is like how do we envision to succeed on both of those sides, right? Like because we have to, of course, build a technological infrastructure for self-sovereignty and functional sovereignty. But we also want to make sure that it's not only the tech people that can enjoy these infrastructures. So like how are you envisioning these non-dichotomical issue to be embraced?
I'm really curious what you share about this, Benjamin, but I'll throw in first, just from like first person experience and being in the Web3 industry for a long time and like, sideline to Occupy is just, I think back to early Web3 days when I ended up starting like a global movement for women, encouraging them to enter into the industry. And there was a trend that actually with Erica Blair, who was one of your previous guests, we had a lot of conversations with people that led us to the clue that to bridge those that were previously uncomfortable in very complicated or technical fields, if we started with the question of like, why do I care about this? Like, what is it that you care about in the world? And then how does this relate to that? And have that be a bridging point. Lots of people from disciplines that had nothing to do with Web3 found relevancy in the topic for them. And I think that sometimes, again, in tech-oriented fields, we can like gravitate to the novelty or the mechanisms first versus like the real world use cases or the why that underpins. And I think that that's something that we can infuse more into this movement to kind of learn from those that have come before.
Yeah, what I would add to that, I wrote a piece a few months ago or last year, called "What is Ethereum for?" Because I think the narrative around blockchains has really been captured by the speculative component of the industry. And I really wonder what would have happened during Occupy if we had DAOs, if we had wallets where shared funds could be pooled and democratically governed. Um, and I think that what made the Occupy movement so powerful was that there was a kind of single spark that revealed something that people had maybe had the sense was true around the corruption of our financial system and government systems. But this kind of focalized it in a way that activated people to participate. And I think there's a general kind of nihilism in the culture now where, we're seeing more and more each day how morally bankrupt the current order is. And yet there isn't really a space for people who want to imagine into what a post-capitalist future could be. Even the climate movement that I'm very deeply woven into is mostly about, protesting fossil fuel companies as opposed to building the real foundations of a regenerative economy. And I think um, I believe that blockchain can still be a place where those people are convened if those of us who care about pro-democratic, pro-social futures really claim it as the substrate for imagining a new social contract. And if block space becomes the collaborative, open-ended, pluralistic design space where we're experimenting with different ways society can be organized, I think that's a big enough tent to bring in people from a lot of different backgrounds, oriented not to a single outcome, but to the process itself of collectively imagining and designing different ways of organizing society.
And something that came to mind as you were talking about occupying that way and like what would have been different if they had wallets is just like the awareness I have in my own community. Like there might have been a time when I was like, everyone needs to have a wallet. Jump on board. And then I'm like, actually, maybe it makes sense for somebody in the community or a small group of people to play that interfacing role with something that's more complex or technical, and not to assume that it's relevant for everyone to engage at that level, but to hold some level of like awareness of and literacy of those considerations in the same way like a community have a webmaster. So I think that's something we might see a lot more of is just starting to get a lot more sober with ourselves on when it comes to blockchain or other technical infrastructure, who is necessary to be engaging at that level of detail or interaction and versus who benefits from the affordances it offers.
Do you have interesting examples of this type of movements which have managed to successfully interweave the cultural and like mainstream component and the technical infrastructure?
I think platform cooperativism and cooperatives in general have tried. I think Zebras Unite is a sort of another one of those movements that started and failed, but learned a tremendous amount along the way. And that was really trying to create a fund to fund cooperatives that had a different kind of organizing logic. Yeah, but I think generally it's very difficult to hold the continuity of a movement like this. I think how we govern it as a commons is one of the biggest issues, because movements tend to be subtly or not so subtly co-opted by institutions. Starting with the commons in mind, I think, is an important piece here because most of the stories that I could tell you are stories of ones that have tried and failed, not very vibrant successes.
I have another contentious question or thoughts to discuss, which is when we think about a movement, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, it is associated with one or a small group of movement leaders, like the steward of that movement, which are also potentially the one that are protecting the movement from co-optation, etc. Like there is like those few individuals, and sometimes it's just one, that are really like holding on to embodying that movement and that are attracting and protecting and nurturing, right? And so it's also interesting because like, and this is kind of like the opposite of a Scenius in some way, in which like the Scenius is actually this more distributed, decentralized cultural scene that emerge. So when we're talking about a movement as opposed to a Scenius, is it possible, and what are the challenges of trying to build a movement which doesn't come with the charismatic leader that is usually associated with that?
What it makes me think of is that any collective effort, I think, in its kind of conception and gestation stages, does need a smaller group of dedicated humans, like parenting the thing into self-sufficiency. And I don't think that movements are any different to that. A phrase that's been really alive for me lately has been like legitimacy through legibility. I don't think that in a lot of cases it's a negative thing to have a couple of humans centered in those early stages, as long as the way that they're operating, making decisions of, yeah, and to express, to enact part of the collective will that they're representing, as long as it is legible to those that are engaging within it. I think actually there's a lot that can be gained from, yeah, that positioning and those roles.
Yeah, I've noted this happening explicitly in the bioregional movement right now in the way that I think it's inevitable, as Patricia mentioned, that institutions and charismatic leaders become kind of focalizations of attention and resources. And that is in some ways necessary, some ways problematic. And so I think my suggestion in the bioregional movement that we're currently implementing with this kind of dual institutional and exstitutional structure that we're developing here on the Front Range of Colorado, where we have a network commons that is totally exstitutional, and then we have a traditional nonprofit that provides the sort of institutional functions as a service, but embedded into the bylaws of that institution is something that I'm calling institutional self-negation. And so I think it's important for the people and the institutions that receive the kind of focalization of that energy to encode into their DNA of either their bylaws or their operating procedures this continuous process of decentering those charismatic leaders or institutions and recentering the exstitutional modes of engagement that are available for people. Because I think it's very easy for cults of personality to form even unintentionally. And so I think as leaders, it's actually our responsibility to hold each other accountable to practice this kind of self negation where we're continuously redirecting the energy that's directed towards us as individuals, as spokespeople, and enabling the community through the institutional structures to benefit from whatever we gain from that kind of focalization of energy that is both necessary and yet a potential pitfall for movements to fall in on themselves around the charismatic leader.
This makes me think of an interesting example of I don't know if we can call it a movement, but like of a powerful community which doesn't come with the charismatic leader, which is like the Freemasons. And in fact, the Freemasons have replaced the charismatic leader with like the protocol. It's like the deeply institutionalized worship of the protocol, which is so strong that you don't actually need the charismatic leader anymore because the protocol is the god in some way. But it's also very, very, very institutional, which is perhaps also not necessarily what we are aiming for. But I think it's interesting to think of protocols as something that at least can play a complementary role to the leaders, to the charismatic leaders, and finding this right balance between institutional dynamics, which are more relational, and institutional dynamics, which are perhaps more codified or protocolized, and trying to see within the network nation, like what kind of combination between those two we can do in order to create a movement that is sufficiently recognizable as a movement because there is a common protocol or common recipe or however we want to call it, but yet also have like all the necessary relationality without having one single or a small group of leaders, right?
This is very alive for Benjamin and I right now related to our work in OpenCivics. And I have to give kudos to our co-steward, Spencer Kavanaugh, who originated this term, but we've kind of decoupled from the term progressive decentralization, and we've really anchored into the term progressive protocolization. So the way that
Mm,
we see ourselves in our movement right now is we're kind of articulating it as three primary phases of maturation. The first being like we're super early, most things are centralized. Hopefully, we have a lot of transparency and accountability. And phase two being like incremental protocolization of our roles as centers of this movement, but doing it in a way that like grounds the reality that like we're not going to get that right. Like we're not all of a sudden going to like push all the decision making authority to members who aren't meaningfully engaged or have the enculturated context. And we hope to eventually graduate to the point that in phase like a phase three version of progressive protocolization, if we did not exist, the thing would continue on.
mhm,
I very much resonate with what you're saying
mm,
on protocols that way.
that's great.
And
I
I
like
think
that.
that it relates to the anti-fragility of our movement. Like in thinking of successful movements that I've been exposed to, I think of the Design Science Studio, which was incredibly successful in like the pandemic era, and then had a personal tragedy happen where their founders were not able to show up unexpectedly, and the movement wanted to continue on, but didn't have any protocols in place to do that. And so, just thinking of those like that learning case very proactively has been important to Benjamin and I.
Mm, really
I'm
cool.
just adding another example because I'm so glad you brought that up, Patricia. And hopefully our phase two transition is complete by the time this podcast comes out. We hold ourselves accountable to that. I also wanted to mention just the Burning Man principles as a form of protocol, and the way in which there is a kind of peer accountability, where when you have those principles clearly defined, the peer enforcement of those protocols is what makes them a viable organizing strategy. Is that um, there are many people enacting the protocol, and that creates a kind of institutional or exstitutional function that, yeah, isn't possible without them. So, yeah, totally aligned with this idea of making protocol a centerpiece of how we think about movement building.
Yeah,
That's
and I'll say most specifically with our work with the Network of Nations Alliance right now is that we're also embedding this in our thinking of trying to articulate at least our like best guess what is it good enough for now, safe enough to try protocols, so that we're creating the surface area by those that have the initiative to engage, have some sense of exposure to what at least our working protocols are that may not have been developed in the most participatory way, but we're so early stage that's maybe not realistic. So for anyone that's listening to this and curious, I think we have a draft right now, but by the time that this published is probably more circulated, is an articulation of a form of constitution for the alliance itself that names that there are people like us in stewardship roles, but very clearly delineates like what rights and responsibilities are associated with that, and creates the ability for anyone at any time that is within that membrane to suggest improvements or to take on a role themselves.
great. So this brings us perfectly to the last section of this podcast, as we have a few minutes left. You two have been very deeply involved in this endeavor of like community building and movement building. So, would you like to describe to our audience like what are the various concrete ways that you have been working towards implementing this movement?
Yeah, I would say the most ambitious and um, l- long-standing aspiration that we've had for the work that we do with Open Civics is at the level of a pattern language for civic infrastructure. Because I think one of the most important pieces for the network effects of network nations is to have a kind of ontology that describes what are the different components of civic life that enable self-organization of communities. And so we've been developing for several years a framework and methodology for the way in which we can categorize and sort those different kind of functional building blocks that communities need to be able to pool resources, make collective decisions, coordinate at the level of their own local community, so that the people who are building these kinds of infrastructures can start to compose more nuanced and complex systems where, one piece of governance tooling and one piece of knowledge commoning infrastructure can actually interface with each other in a way that unlocks new capabilities. And so that's the part of the intersection of open civics and network nations that is one of the most concrete things I hope we can achieve is creating that knowledge commons that enables a kind of plug and play, almost like Lego blocks of social systems. And that work is always unfinished, but definitely I think part of our aspiration with open civics and network nations.
And aside from that, more recently, to help this movement emerge, we've been contributing to first identifying that we needed to delineate our collective efforts from the concept of network nations itself. So that's where the name Network Nations Alliance came from, which is like a coordinative loose affiliation. And then looking at our areas of online presence that would convey the context and relationship between those two things, which has been like creating a little bit of a light brand identity, overhauling the website, making sure that it's connected to GitHub so other people can be suggesting changes and not very little gatekeeping in that way. We're also, as Benjamin kind of mentioned earlier, like focusing on rhythms and cycles. So right now we're doing like a monthly member or like a monthly open call just to see like who already is in the Scenius. Like, can we make them known? Can we create an attractor that's enticing enough for them to want to identify that they are part of this movement, which I think it creates a cascade effect for credibility that is very important at these early stages. And aside from that, it's just the dissemination of both the underpinning theory that has been developed from a couple of core people like you, Primavera, but also amplifying the works from others that maybe we previously were unaware of, which also means like developing a Substack, having this podcast, and then creating that space, which right now is the website, and then in synchronous form on the calls where we kind of connect and glue all those things together as we're in relationship to one another. I think that that's an important piece that you've been really great actually about encouraging, P, is as much as, you're partially one of the originators of this theory and concept and should be accredited. So it's not just about you, it's about amplifying the voices of all the others as well. And I think that that's what we've been trying to nurture over these last few months pretty successfully.
Yeah, and we're very, very grateful for all the work you've done. So, what is the call to action for everyone listening to the podcast and that would like to somehow join the movement or hear more about this or get involved?
Yeah, I think that the very easy ways are to like find us on all the normal social channels and just follow along how development goes if you want to kind of have a hands off but curious way of relating. And then if you want to go a little bit deeper, I would say attend one of the monthly calls. Listen in. Feel free to contribute, but don't feel like you have to. It's also just a great way to network and to meet people with shared values and generative pursuits. And then if you are very enticed and want to help us build alongside us this movement, there's a form on the website that will help you transition into membership. We're just establishing membership at the moment, but that would be the best way to get involved is to just identify that you're already part of this shared effort.
Amazing. Great. Thank you so much. That was great. And I guess it's just the beginning. The movement is growing as we speak. So thanks a lot. And yeah, we'll be in touch.
Thanks, Primavera.
Thanks.